I do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Hello?
Hello. Hello. Have you got your brief of evidence with you that you prepared for the Royal Commission?
Yes, I do.
Can you state your full name for the record?
Yes, my full name is Mary Ann OHagan.
Mary, it's Anand Satyanan speaking. Can I, in order to comply with the Inquiries Act, first of all obtain an affirmation from you? Do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before the Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Ms. James.
Mary, can you provide some background information to the Commission about what has led you to give expert evidence today?
Yes. Well, I initially came into this area because I was a user of mental health services for a number of years in my 20s. And I was a revolving door patient inside psychiatric hospitals, and was given a very pessimistic prognosis about my future, which was totally wrong. But after I came out of that experience, I was one of the initiators of the psychiatric survivor movement in New Zealand. Then I went on to become the first chair of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. And through that role, I became an advisor to the WHO and the United Nations, and also had a hand in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That was while I was a commissioner at the New Zealand Mental Health Commissioner. I held that role for 6.5 years. Since then, I've run a social enterprise, and I've now just taken on a role as program lead for the Like Minds Like Mine program to uphold the mana and human rights of people with mental distress. Now, I want to say in some of the publicity, it says I'm an abuse survivor. I've never called myself an abuse survivor, but I have witnessed abuse. I have heard stories of abuse. I have, read research about abuse and so on. So I'm very familiar with the whole territory.
Thank you. And in your introduction, you've talked about your view of abuse and whether it's widespread in mental health services and whether there are some good aspects. Do you want to just briefly comment on that?
Yes, so yes, I believe that abuse is widespread and continues to be widespread. I think it changes its spots over time. But on the other hand, I think I want to acknowledge that even for people who've been abused, they have had experiences of compassion and kindness. And some people say they have benefited from mental health services. But this doesn't take away the gravity of the abuse that has gone on.
And when you talk about mental health or mental illness, what perspective do you use that term from? Well,
the concept of mental illness is used it comes from Western medicine, and really it's only been around for 200 years, and it didn't exist in traditional Māori society, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And it was really, you know, the idea of mental illness and the whole sort of psychiatric apparatus was imported as part of the colonial infrastructure of New Zealand. And I just want to add that this psychiatric apparatus or infrastructure from the 1840s on was an institutional one, and New Zealand's psychiatric hospital numbers peaked in 1944. They stopped planning for new psychiatric hospitals in 1963, and they capped bed numbers in 1973. At the same time, there was an expansion of community-based treatment in inpatient units attached to general hospitals, and by 1999, all the large psychiatric hospitals had closed or been severely downsized.
And if you were summarising, oh, sorry, you carry on.
No, you keep going.
If you were summarising that move from institutionalisation to deinstitutionalisation and subsequent events, you've talked about inquiries and law changes. Can you just expand on that slightly?
So as the hospitals began to close in the early 90s, the money did not always follow into new services. In fact, the health services took them to do other things, took the money. And a crisis led to the Mason Review into mental health services in 1995-96. And as a result of this review and the establishment of the Mental Health Commission, the government increased funding for community mental health support services over the next decade. And New Zealand is a little bit ahead of many other countries in that about 25% of our services are community-based support services, and 75% of the funding goes into the traditional, you know, psychiatry, hospital, clinical services. And in anticipation, there was also a law change because in anticipation of the closure of the long-stay hospitals, New Zealand passed the current Mental Health Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act in 1992. Now, this introduced compulsory community treatment, and I believe this has been a kind of a new area for abuse, but it also tightened the criteria for committal and developed legal procedures for people to appeal to be released from the Act, which have proven to be pretty ineffective. You there? I'm finished that part.
Yep. I'm having my own technology problem. In your introduction, you mentioned that you were one of the people who started the survivor movement in New Zealand. Can you talk about the survivor movement, how it came to New Zealand and what it meant?
Right, so the survivor movement began with a whole lot of other liberation movements in North America and parts of Europe in the 1970s. Many people who participated in the movement had experienced psychiatric abuse. And these are actions that harmed their bodies, their minds, their spirit, their self-worth, and their standing in the world. Many of these actions were done lawfully and within the boundaries of acceptable practice. And I think this is really, this is a key point. And they range from seclusion, forced medication, locked hospitals, physical force, emotional neglect, degrading conditions, the pathologizing of human distress, prognoses of doom, and the crushing and validation of lived experience insights. And all these forms of abuse continue today. So the movement didn't reach New Zealand until the mid-1980s. And over a short time, survivors set up a lot of local networks that provided support and advocacy. And the first national network was established in 1990. And since the mid-1980s, the movement has done quite a number of things which I outline in my statement. But I just want to highlight a couple of them today. They put pressure on the government to establish a confidential forum for inpatients into psychiatric hospitals. Subsequently to make an
Can I intervene for a moment, Mary, to ask you to speak a little more slowly? The evidence that you're giving is being stenotyped at very high speed, but not sufficiently to cope with your speed at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. I will slow down. So one of the activities of the survivor movement was to put pressure on the government to establish a confidential forum for former inpatients of psychiatric hospitals, and subsequently to make a public apology, which has not yet happened. There was the End Seclusion Now campaign in 2014 and participation in system-led projects to reduce and eliminate seclusion. We've had a reduction in seclusion, but no elimination. Research and raising awareness on the harm caused by psychotropic drugs, and also the development of the Wellbeing Manifesto in 2018, which called for an end to health-led services.
You know that the Royal Commission Terms of Reference has a definition of abuse, but in your paper you use a different definition. Can you outline why that is and what your definition that you use in the paper is?
So it's not really a different definition. It includes all those elements, but it also includes the abuse by the the Royal Commission definition conceptualises abuse by the type of impact it has on the person, but it doesn't really capture the many different contexts or forms of abuse that are part of coercive and institutional services. And so I sort of stretched it out a bit and talked about environmental, procedural, legislative, treatment, psychological, physical, sexual, cultural, property, and narrative forms of abuse.
And before we turn to look at each... Oh, carry on.
No, you carry on.
Before turning to look at each of those forms of abuse, is there anything that you would like to say about the underlying dynamics of abuse?
Yes, so there is a question about why has abuse in mental health services been allowed to happen so often and for so long? And why does the community accept abuse for one group of people and not for others? I think there's a profoundly simple answer to this question, and that is that extreme states of mental distress have zero status as a human experience, and this taints most human responses to it. The response might be fear, hostility, the desire to control, incomprehension, paternalism, or pity. And they might be well-intentioned or not well-intentioned, but they all trace back to the ancient taproot of stigma. Stigma strips people of their human status and sets the stage for discrimination, human rights abuses, and social exclusion. Throughout history and across cultures, the ways and means of expressing stigma have varied. Over the last 200 years in the West, the official expressions have been four things: institutionalisation, compulsory intervention, the dominance of medicine, and for Māori, the process of colonisation. And I want to go into a little bit more detail about the process of colonisation. As I said before, the mental health system has been part of a colonising infrastructure which has imposed additional harm on Māori. Prior to the 1960s, few Māori were admitted to mental health services. However, between 1959 and 1987, the number increased significantly. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, Māori continued to be disproportionately represented in statistics for mental health admissions, involuntary treatment, and seclusion. In 1991, Dr. Erahana Ryan described the disproportionate rate of distress among Māori as, quote, fundamentally an expression of colonisation, unquote. Māori are 15% of the population, but make up over 25% of people who use mental health services. Māori experienced increased rates of admission and involuntary treatment after the 1960s. While these increases were in part reflected by Māori urbanisation, evidence indicates that colonisation and systemic racism were ultimately responsible. And of course, there are other groups that have been somewhat overrepresented or have been more prone to abuse than some others. And women and girls, their admissions appear to have reflected prevailing norms about women's gender roles, and some were sent following experience inside the social welfare system, and many young women were admitted to psychiatric hospitals for postpartum depression that often stayed for many years. And there are dynamics in play for infants and young children who were sent to psychiatric hospitals, sometimes in response to their families, men and boys who were often sent in response to antisocial behaviour, and disabled people and people with physical health conditions subjected to forced treatment, and people with gender identity and sexual orientation that did not meet the norm. Also quite frequently led to diagnoses and forced treatment.
Thank you. And moving then on to the various abuse categories you outlined earlier, what do you define as environmental abuse?
That includes institutionalisation, locked wards, solitary confinement, and separation from family and whānau. And the Confidential Forum reported that the physical environments of psychiatric hospitals were bleak and depressing. For instance, a former staff member from Tokanui Hospital described how people were housed in large, mixed-age, gendered dormitories. Hospital buildings were sterile, barren, bleak, lifeless, institutional, and often neglected by health authorities. Families too spoke of forbidding buildings, dirty, noisy, smelly environments, smoke-filled rooms, lack of privacy, and of patients not wearing their own clothes. I worked as a coordinator of psychiatric survivors support and advocacy services in Carrington Hospital in 1998. and I observed most of the wards at Carrington were shaped like a big T, with a long corridor running down towards the dormitory. First there was the nurses' station, then came the little kitchen, which was locked most of the time, so the patients couldn't make a mess or burn themselves. The drug room was opposite. Then came the dining room, which always smelt of overcooked cauliflower. Next up the corridor was the patient's living room, which usually had a ripped pool table in the middle, and people sitting on chairs, chain smoking and looking blankly at the wall. Next were the bathrooms, with no shower curtains or door locks. They faced the laundry, the property rooms, and the seclusion rooms. At the end of the dormitory, at the end of the corridor, came the dormitory. Alistair Russell talked to Julie Liebrick in the 90s about the prison-like conditions in Oakley Hospital in the early 1970s, where he was a patient. In the 5 years I was in Male 3, I went through 22,000 locked doors. Every door I went through was locked. I mean, your cell door was locked. The door up to the stairs to the cell rooms was locked. The door at the bottom of the stairs was locked. The tea room door was locked. The day room door was locked. The kitchen door was locked. The dining room door was locked. Every door you went through was unlocked before you and locked after you.
Mary, just before we carry on, we're going to get into the area of your evidence where there are a number of quotes. Can you confirm, please, that any quotes in your evidence are either from public sources or that you have consent to use them?
Yes, I have got consent to use them, and they're all from public sources, but I sought consent from the people who are still alive, but they're all published. Yep.
Thank you. You then go on to talk about solitary confinement. So having gone from all of those locked rooms, there was an additional layer. Can you talk a bit about that and why they were used?
Yeah. Solitary confinement is otherwise known as seclusion, which I think is a rather euphemistic term and a term I tend not to use. It is the placing of a person in a bare room without the ability to make an exit. It continues to be routine practice in institutional settings, and there are still seclusion rooms being built in modern acute inpatient units today. Survivors at the Confidential Forum and the Confidential Listening and Assistance Service talked about solitary confinement as extremely frightening and re-traumatizing. Threats of solitary confinement were also routinely used to instill fear and control people. Denise Calto, in a publication, talked about her experiences of physical restraint and solitary confinement in the early 1990s. And I quote, "They committed me to Tokanui, and it was the worst thing. For a start, I was taken straight into an isolation unit, and I was strapped down until I was in a side room." I think a side room here is a solitary confinement room. Of course, we were all going through the rigmarole of having to strip naked, and if you don't, they'll do it for you, sort of thing, and not being allowed to be left with your knickers or your socks or anything like that, and being left in this place. Nobody came to speak to me for ages. There was some interesting graffiti on the wall, like Motel Hell or something like that, and I thought afterwards, that's not wrong. End of quote. Egan Bidwar talked recently on a podcast about the over-medication and abuses that led him to being put into solitary confinement in 1990. And I quote, "A couple of orderlies would pick me up from my room and shuffle drag me to the day room. They would sit me in a chair with pretty much leave me there to drool all over myself. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. If you're unable to ask someone to help you go to the toilet, it eventually happens, and someone notices the smell. If you're lucky, they take you to the showers, get you cleaned, and take you to the day room again. A couple of times, you would be dragged out to the front yard. You would be stripped down, hosed, and given a bit of a kicking for being a filthy mongrel, and tossed into a seclusion room as a punishment." End of quote.
There's also the issue you talk about of separation from family and whānau.
Yep. According to the confidential forum, survivors were often forcibly parted from whānau, parents, partners, or siblings. Contact with families and whānau was infrequent. Some whānau were told by staff that it would be best to stay away. Separation from whānau left survivors more vulnerable to abuse. Anne Helm was incarcerated in several psychiatric hospitals in the 1970s, and she said, "Remember, these were places where outsiders in the form of visitors were rarely seen."
The Royal Commission heard the other day from Arthur Taylor that he had been put into a psychiatric unit without a diagnosis. In your evidence, you talk about procedural abuse. What do you mean, and what examples would you like to share with the Commission?
I can't comment on Arthur Taylor's story, but by procedural abuse, we mean processes such as admission, assessment, and the administration of treatment. Many survivors talk to the confidential forum and the confidential listening and assistance service about forceful, cruel, and brutal admission processes. They often had no idea why they had been admitted to hospital. They were subjected to decisions made by others, not informed of their diagnosis, and received treatment without informed consent. Survivors reported rarely seeing a doctor or seeing multiple different doctors over time. They also recalled being routinely observed and written about in clinical records based on nurses and psychiatrists' judgment rather than their own experiences. Survivors used terms such as terrified, alone, abandoned, and confused to describe their experience of psychiatric hospitalisation. Many survivors spoke of a general lack of communication, interaction, and interest from staff. They also described widespread lack of care and compassion, ranging from indifference to overtly violent behaviour. The confidential forum reported that people's experiences of trauma or adversity were usually disregarded in the assessment and treatment process. Survivors often said they were not listened to and their experiences were disbelieved. Sometimes staff did not know important details about survivors, for instance, that they had children. Institutional procedures were especially harmful for Māori, who have talked about having Indigenous knowledge, values and experiences pathologised and medicated, resulting in a loss of Māori identity.
Just a note for the commissioners, the paper has a large number of quotes. We won't be going through each of the quotes, but they are there and we would absolutely invite anyone to read those. Mary, on that basis, can we turn to legislative abuse, please?
Yes, so legislative abuse includes the use of legal coercion. I say particularly beyond the scope of the law, but I believe that the law itself is abusive. And so survivors talked extensively about being forcibly placed in psychiatric hospitals. While many were subject to mental health legislation, others were subjected to coercive practices despite their voluntary status. Forced detention and treatment were often experienced as torture, traumatising, inhuman, degrading and cruel. Survivors on admission were often stripped, bathed without privacy and had their clothes taken away and forced into solitary confinement. Māori was lived experience, who were more likely to be sectioned than non-Māori, have also talked about the violations they experienced under the Mental Health Act, and I quote, "I've been degraded by people in positions of authority who are funded by the tax-paying government to serve and protect us, not abuse and mistreat those in the community who are treated worse than dogs under the mask of New Zealand's Mental Health Act. I felt ashamed and fearful. My mental state of mind further deteriorated due to their response. I felt traumatised, and I felt that my basic human rights as a woman had been blatantly violated."
You've also spoken about treatment abuse, and you particularly talk about the effects of psychotropic drugs and also ECT. Can you summarise your views on those?
So in the period 1950 to 1999, psychotropic drugs came in the 50s, and electroconvulsive therapy was being used before 1950. There were other treatments, but these were the mainstay. Some very drastic, terrible treatments in the early part of the period were insulin shock therapy and lobotomies. I will be talking a little bit more about deep sleep therapy, which went into the 70s. The first generation antipsychotics used from the 1950s to the 2000s caused a disfiguring condition called tardive dyskinesia, and this is permanent involuntary movements that included grimacing, sticking out of the tongue and smacking of the lips. And of course, the hospitals prescribed paraldehyde until the 1970s, and there's a graphic description of how horrible this was for the people who were administered it in the Gallen report. Survivors who spoke at the confidential forum and the Listening and Assistance Service described the use of these drugs in high doses and the use of polypharmacy. They really gave informed consent. Medications were sometimes given to sedate and control rather than to produce therapeutic benefit. Some survivors reported the administration of paraldehyde. Many survivors, as well as their family members, reported that their mental health deteriorated significantly as a result of treatment. And I want to add that the second generation antipsychotics that have been around since 2000 also have a very poor effect on people's physical health, and they are known to be life-shortening. The overuse of medication severely
and you said you'd come back to deep sleep therapy at paragraph 50.
Yeah.
There's a quote that you wanted to share.
So Anne Helm wrote about her experience of deep sleep therapy at Cherry Farm Hospital in the 1970s, and I quote, "I was placed on a 6-week deep sleep program where the main concern was the constant taking of blood pressure because of the huge amounts of medication coursing through my body could potentially paralyze and stop fundamental physical functioning. At the end of this treatment, my legs atrophied from complete bed rest. I could not support my bloated weight. I was barely able to lift my head from a pillow." End of quote.
And you spoke earlier about Lake Alice and Justice Gallen's report. What else would you say about electroconvulsive therapy?
So psychiatric hospitals routinely administered unmodified ECT until the mid-50s, when modified ECT using anaesthetics and muscle relaxants became recommended practice. However, Sir Rodney Gallen's report on Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital gives clear evidence that the use of unmodified ECT went through to the 1970s at least. It also documents the use of ECT as a punishment administered on children and young people's legs and genitals. It described these ECT practices as a regime of terror, and they were reported to the United Nations Committee on the Convention Against Torture.
And then in paragraph 54, there was a quote about the length of ECT treatments administered.
Yeah. So Egan Bidwar talked about his experience of ECT as torture, and I quote, "I received, this was in 1990, I received 27 courses of ECT, 27 times being carried off, strapped down to a table, and having the national grid pumped through my skull. I distinctly remember being strapped down and had one of the orderlies lean over me and abuse me and tell me unless I play the game, they will keep doing this. They basically fried me until my head was smashing against the table. That wasn't treatment for me, it was torture," unquote.
And another form of abuse you speak of is psychological abuse. How do you define that, and what would you like to say?
Psychological abuse includes bullying, threats, cruelty and put-downs. The Confidential Forum and the Listening and Assistance Service reported that survivors talked about many kinds of psychological abuses by staff. This included demeaning jokes, emotional abuse and cruelty.
And then we go on to physical abuse.
Okay. Physical abuse includes hitting and physically forcing people. According to the Confidential Forum, survivors recalled many kinds of physical abuses by staff, such as being punched, thrown on the floor, pushed up against a wall, or being given unmodified ECT. The institutional milieu was punctuated with screaming and yelling, physical violence, and manhandling people into ECT or solitary confinement. In the 1980s, I interviewed Gerald about his time in Oakley Hospital, and I quote, "Oh sure, I've been beaten up by staff. At the secure hospital, there was a rule you had to strip naked in the corridor, leave your clothes out, go into your room totally naked, and get your pajamas on and go to bed. I found that really hard to do because of my physical disability. So I took my clothes off in my room. I had 3 buttons undone on my shirt, and they literally ripped my clothes right off me, pants and all, testicles squashed. It was standard practice," unquote.
From paragraph 62, you talk about sexual abuse and where that abuse came from. Describe further.
So sexual abuse includes non-consensual sexual contact or harassment. These Confidential Forum, the Listening Assistance Service, both reported that survivors talked about sexual abuse by staff, including rape. Survivors also reported sexual and physical abuse by other residents within the context of high levels of distress and unsafe, mixed-aged and mixed-gender facilities. Debbie Peterson wrote about her experience of... Yep.
Carry on.
Are you there? She wrote about her experiences of sexual abuse.
Can you hear me?
In hospital in the 1990s. Yes. And I quote her, "During one hospital admission when I was 26, I was sexually abused by a male nurse. I reported it, and eventually the police were called. I was taken to the police station, gave my statement, and returned to the ward. Naively, I thought I'd be okay there. Instead, I was put in the same seclusion room the incident happened in, told I wasn't to talk to anyone, and was looked after, in quotes, by some very angry nurses. It was apparent they didn't believe me. I was terrified," end of quote.
You've spoken about Maori experience and you talk about cultural abuse and a Waitangi tribunal proceeding.
At this point, Ms Jones, we're approaching 3:30, which might be a good time to take the afternoon adjournment. Would this be a suitable time?
Certainly would, sir.
Hello.
Thank you. I think there's an expectation that we will finish at 5.
Thank you, sir. Welcome back.
Hello?
Explain what you meant by that in the Waitangi tribunal proceedings.
Right. Cultural abuse includes colonisation, racism, and the denial of access to cultural worldviews and support. The Y2575 report on Māori health inequity states that colonisation in the form of assimilationist policies and practices and institutional racism have marginalised Māori knowledge systems, ways of knowing and values. Māori experiences of psychiatric abuse are compounded by the impact of colonisation and alienation from whenua, whakapapa and whānau, which are the key ingredients for well-being. The Confidential Forum reported that Māori survivors experienced a violation of their cultural values, beliefs and experiences within the mental health system. Their experiences were routinely pathologised, and this caused significant harm.
And it wasn't just Maori who were impacted by this, is it?
No, I want to quote a young Pacifica woman who talked about racism in hospital in the 1990s. And I quote, "When I was in hospital, I found all the Pākehā nurses used to treat their race better. We were looked at like underdogs, like they always got their dinner served first. They got special privileges. Us islanders didn't. We were just chucked in there, had breakfast, lunch and tea, and that's about all." End of quote.
And another aspect of abuse is property abuse, and you talk about something called an interest scandal. Can you outline what the abuse is and what happened with that scandal?
Yeah, so by property abuse we mean, withholding or stealing money or goods. The hospital, so the hospital admission process usually involved, where's the interest scandal? What paragraph are you, oh, here we go. So I'll just start by saying that the process involved the removal of clothing and personal property. People didn't have free access to their money. Many smoked cigarettes and staff controlled access to them as part of a reward and punishment regime. In the 1970s and 80s, in what became known as the interest scandal, the hospitals kept the interest money from individuals' welfare benefit payments that were paid into hospital trust accounts. The practice was stopped in 1987 when the Department of Health was advised that withholding interest money from welfare benefit claimants was probably illegal.
And when you talk about narrative abuse, what does that mean to you, and have you had personal experience of that?
Yes, so narrative abuse includes prognoses of doom and a focus, pretty much a sole focus on people's deficits. Before I go into my own experience, I want to talk about survivors at the Confidential Forum who recalled how staff often viewed them with a deficits lens and gave them a bleak narrative about their future. And these narratives led to hopelessness and contributed to negative consequences across all spheres of survivors' lives. And my own personal experience, at the age of 21, I was given a prognosis of doom by my psychiatrist, and I quote, "Dr. Tilling is standing at his desk sorting through a large, untidy stack of files. He sits down, opens my file, and his face turns serious. I think it's timely for me to tell you about the impact of that your illness is likely to have on you. You have a chronic condition which will recur for the rest of your life." And I say, "Do I really?" And he says, "The medication can help, but you need to reduce stress and lower your horizon. A big career or full-time work probably aren't options, I'm afraid, and you need to think very carefully about having children in case they inherit their illness." "Does anyone recover?" I ask. "Not usually," he says. "I'll see you next week." He looks up and smiles, then starts writing his notes as I close the door behind me. My eyes fill with tears.
I'm delighted you proved him wrong. In terms of then moving on to impact of the various abuses that you've spoken about, Can you just describe those starting
Yes,
from paragraph 80 and the quotes that you want to share in the following paragraphs?
Right. Survivors at the confidential forum and listening and assistance service reported that they continued to experience lifelong psychological distress. They recalled living with low self-esteem, frightening memories, frequent nightmares, hypervigilance, shame, grief, sadness and loss, anger and rage because of abuse within services. Many described their overwhelming struggle to make sense of multiple abuses. Survivors suffered losses in many areas of life. They lost connection to whakapapa, whānau and whenua. For many survivors, the damage to identity, the loss of human status, and the violation of human rights permanently damaged their roles and status as citizens.
And you interviewed a number of survivors in the 1980s and reached some conclusions. What were they?
I wrote, many had never talked about their experience in one sitting before to someone who took them at their word. Some cried as they talked about all the pain they had endured. So much of it was not due to the experience of madness itself, but about their experiences in hospital, their lost opportunities, about once promising young lives that had fallen into unemployment, poverty, and loneliness. They talked again and again of hospital staff who took their dignity away or never talked to them, the overuse of drugs, of seclusion, the trauma of compulsory treatment, the lack of psychotherapy and support, and the lack of information about drugs and side effects. So much of their suffering could have been avoided if the mental health system and the rest of society had genuinely responded to them. End of quote.
And you also quote from Anne Helm about the trauma that went unattended, which is a feature particularly of those with disabilities.
And Anne wrote, denial of experience also deeply buried in the etched traumatic memories of some institutional experiences and invalidated healthy reactions of natural grief and anger. Earlier losses, the death of my mother, the loss of a singing career, the removal of my firstborn daughter to others' care, lay unattended. No one had deemed these events important enough to support me to talk about them. End quote.
And can you briefly summarise the impact on abuse on poor life and health outcomes?
Yes, so many survivors have talked about trauma from abuse, leading to addiction, self-harm, suicidality and physical health conditions. Some die prematurely while others die by suicide. Many survivors live in poverty and have lost opportunities for education, secure employment and stable housing. Many relied on income support or ACC and had to deal with the work and income or ACC staff whose processes often mirrored the abuse in the mental health system, of being monitored, misjudged and incorrectly written about after sharing intimate details of their lives. And that was to the confidential forum.
We've spoken about broken whānau and community connections and the impact on Maori, but is there anything further that you would like to say about those before we move on to another topic?
Yes, the stigma of being admitted to a psychiatric hospital, coupled with routine medical advice of the time, often meant long-term separation from families and whānau. Most whānau visited infrequently or stayed away. For some survivors, disconnection from families and whānau resulted in a lifelong sense of abandonment and feeling of not belonging. Sometimes ashamed families and whānau avoided contact with survivors or constructed narratives about survivors that were themselves abusive. Many survivors described their struggle in trusting others, developing and maintaining relationships, and sustaining a sense of connection. And this was again through the confidential forum.
And you've got a quote at paragraph 92 where a kaimahi Māori told the mental health and addiction inquiry something that may resonate for many. Can you share that with the Commission, please?
Yes, this was from this kaimahi Māori said, whānau are fearful of our ministry, fearful of mental health, fearful of oranga tamariki taking our children, fearful of police who take away their dads. Whānau are on the back foot before anything that happened, just because they are Māori. And I have another quote here from a whānau of a person with lived experience who talked about the corrosive impact of colonisation and alien systems on Māori. These alien systems denied, and still do, the harm that had been wrought in the collective body, mind and heart of Māoridom, while at the same time demonising Māori people and culture for the outcomes of these harms. Alongside widespread economic, physical and spiritual deprivation from the erasure of conditions necessary for life, and also our spiritual and well-being institutions and practitioners. Systemic denigration of Māori began to carve into my grandfather and grandmother's hearts and minds the notion of their inherent inferiority and fated impairment. They began to despise themselves and all things Māori as they internalised and acted out colonial-induced systemic self-hate. The echoes of this hate infestation continue to resound through our personal and collective hearts and minds. End of quote.
Mary, we then turn to mental health services after 1999, and you've quoted from the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry. So what would you like to say about what could or should happen into the future?
So there have been some good developments in mental health services since 1999, particularly the growth of community support services. But we still have a system where clinical approaches are dominant. There is still continuing institutionalisation, and we have rising rates of compulsory treatment. And I want to focus a bit on compulsory treatment. Many submitters to the government inquiry into mental health and addiction spoke of their experience of compulsory detention, often for long periods of time, being forcibly treated and being denied the right to self-determination and participation in decisions about treatment. They also described the trauma associated with compulsion, the adverse impact of forced medication, and the harm caused by solitary confinement. And I quote from the inquiry report: "Throughout this inquiry, many people shared their experiences of being held and compulsorily treated under mental health legislation and prolonged use of the Mental Health Act. Many submitters across the country emphasised the need for New Zealand legislation and the practices enabled under it to comply with international and human rights instruments."
Shine some light into the doom. Have there been any changes that have any impact to stop abuse since 1999?
There have been changes and there have been some developments, but I think they really have yet to reach fruition. So, and that's both at the international and national level. And, 20 years on, abuse in mental health services continues despite the closure of the long-stay institutions, rhetoric about recovery, and the development of human rights protection.
And
One
there
of
have
the
been
changes,
the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Is there anything you'd like to say about those developments?
yes, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities states that persons with disabilities, and that includes people with mental distress, are equal before the law and should not be deprived of their liberty because of their disability. As a result, much of the commentary coming from the United Nations is critical of mental health legislation. For instance, the Special Rapporteur for the Disabilities Convention has made it clear that mental health legislation that permits discrimination, forced treatment, substituted decision-making, and the best interest standard must be repealed. Member states, including New Zealand, appear to be in denial about the full implications of the Convention, and they respond to the Convention by seeking reform to legislation rather than repeal of it.
And we know one of the recommendations from the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry was replace and repeal the Mental Health Compulsory and Assessment Treatment Act. Do you have any sense about whether that will resolve the concerns that you've expressed in your evidence completely?
No, I don't have a lot of confidence that replacing the Act as is the plan is going to resolve the issues in a thorough way. And there is good evidence, both formal evidence and anecdotal evidence from Victoria and Australia, that changing the Act does not make any difference to what actually happens. And that's because the people who administer the Act, they may be chastised for not using it enough. They're never chastised for using it too much.
And in terms of the rights of Indigenous peoples, how would you characterise the involvement of the Treaty of Waitangi in mental health service design and delivery?
Well, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples specifically recognises the right to enforcement of treaties, and that includes the Treaty of Waitangi. And I'm going to be talking a bit more later on about the implications of this for Māori service development going forward.
And very briefly, there have been inquiries and compensations and apologies. So from paragraph 106, you talk about the Lake Alice settlement and the Crown Health Financing Agency. Can you just summarise your thoughts on those points?
Yes, so the confidential forum for former inpatients of psychiatric hospitals was established in 2004, but its terms of reference were kept narrow, I believe, to avoid Crown liability. It was set up to provide a confidential environment for people to talk about their experiences, to support them to find counselling and other assistance services, and to report on the numbers of participants, the services they were referred to, and the usefulness of the process to participants. While the report stretched the boundaries of the terms of reference by giving a thematic summary of people's experiences, there was no substantive response from the government towards a formal apology or compensation for survivors. And this is something that is very keenly felt by some survivors. And I want to acknowledge Anne Helm, who was on the panel of the confidential forum, who is herself a survivor. And the valiant effort she took after the forum reported to organise an apology, but to no avail. So we really believe that that the Royal Commission is our next opportunity for this to happen. The Residual Health Management Unit, which was later named the Crown Health Financing Agency, was formed in '93 to manage the residual public health system assets and liabilities that could not be transferred to the new Crown Health enterprises. Among them were claims associated with historical abuse and neglect in psychiatric hospitals. By 2011, the Crown Health Funding Agency had received 336 psychiatric patient claims. It developed a settlement strategy in consultation with plaintiffs' lawyers, and in 2012 made offers to the plaintiffs that included a modest wellness payment, payment of legal costs related to the complaint, and a letter of apology. All but 7 of the plaintiffs accepted.
Turning then to complaints and resolution mechanisms, you've talked about 3 mechanisms, but can I just point you to paragraph 110 where you talk about people under the Mental Health Act and the Review Tribunal, and you had specific thoughts about that.
People subjected to the Mental Health Act can, since 1992, seek review through the Family Court or the Mental Health Review Tribunal. There is strong evidence these processes put in place to protect human rights and prevent mental health system abuse do not work well. For instance, in 2017, the Mental Health Review Tribunal heard 62 applications for release from the Act. Of those applications, only 6 people were released.
And in terms of the program to achieve zero seclusion by 2020, what are your thoughts on that, and in particular in relation to Maori and the use of seclusion and restraint?
There have been some successes, but the Mental Health Commissioner has recently highlighted a high rate of seclusion for Māori and noted that although the overall seclusion rate has decreased 30% since 2007, the seclusion rate for Māori has only decreased by 9%. In 2016, 102 young people aged 19 or less were secluded. There remains wide variation in the use of seclusion and restraint across district health boards. Seclusion rooms continue to be built in new mental health facilities in 2019.
And Mary, under the terms of reference, the Royal Commission has a forward-looking mandate, and you've spoken about the E Koro Anō campaign that led to the Royal Commission. I'd like to invite you to read from paragraph 115, because you have set out what your thoughts are about areas the Royal Commission could think of so it doesn't happen again.
Yes, abuse in mental health services will continue until most, if not all, institutions are replaced by community-based responses. There is an end to special mental health legislation for people diagnosed with mental illness, and psychiatry is replaced at the hub of the system by communities who control the narrative and resources, including Māori, Pacifica, and people with lived experience of distress. At the same time, we need to continue to work to reduce stigma and discrimination in the wider community. I'm now going to talk about redress and rehabilitation. The process of redress and rehabilitation for people abused in mental health services has not got off to a good start in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The report of the Confidential Forum did not lead to real redress and rehabilitation, and there has been little public acknowledgement, and the settlement process with affected individuals has not been completed. And these statements were echoed by Judge Henwood in her report of the Confidential Listening and Assistance Service. The Royal Commission provides an opportunity to establish a more deliberate and comprehensive redress and rehabilitation process. And I think the survivor perception of the process so far is that it has been piecemeal and half-hearted. And I think the Royal Commission needs to show that this country has a commitment to redress and rehabilitation. And of course, survivors need to lead decision-making about the process. And I want to talk a little bit about a good process. And for this, I thank Dr. Heather Barnett. The aim must be to fully recognise and enable healing across all spheres of survivors' lives. Claims need to be assessed against national and international human rights frameworks. The state must ensure that the process and people leading it are independent from government and organisations that have perpetuated abuse. The process needs to be administered by people who have a sophisticated understanding of human rights, abuse and trauma. The system needs to be straightforward and prompt. I now want to go on to the issue of apology. Survivors of psychiatric abuse have called for 2 public apologies, one from the state and one from the Royal College of New Zealand, Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. Survivors need a complete apology, as Maris elucidated. This includes an acknowledgement of the wrong committed, including the harm it caused, an acceptance of responsibility for having committed the wrong, an expression of regret or remorse, both for the harm and for having committed the wrong, a commitment, explicit or implicit, to reparation, a commitment to non-repetition of the wrong. We haven't achieved this in New Zealand, and Dees felt in her paper quoted in the statement said that the government apology on the Lake Alice abuses did not reach the threshold in Maris's definition. The process leading to apology, especially for survivors of abuse and mental health services, needs to affirm the reality of their experiences, which have often been routinely denied. The apology also needs to acknowledge survivors who have died and to extend the apology to their families and whānau. Survivors have called for belated public acknowledgement of the report of the Confidential Forum published in 2007. They are seeking acknowledgement of the report at the start of the Royal Commission of Inquiry's report and identification of how the voices of people who participated in the Confidential Forum have been included in the Royal Commission's processes and recommendations. They also want the report to be widely disseminated throughout New Zealand. I want to talk about monetary redress. Monetary redress needs to involve consideration of 5 key factors. Is it in the survivor's interest? Are realistic costs given by the state? Is the process transparent? Does it include ongoing support for survivors? And is justice being served to survivors? And I would, if you haven't already, I would ask you to read Winter 2018, cited in this report. Winter compares the processes for people who are state wards in New Zealand and Ireland, and New Zealand does not come out very well on that comparison. He said the costs awarded by the state were very low in New Zealand compared to Ireland, probably about, I think, about 1/5. And I think also there may be inconsistency between the Lake Alice payouts and the payouts that have been subsequently given, for instance, through the Crown Health Funding Authority. And I think that probably needs further examination. Has there been consistency to date? But certainly to ensure that we have a realistic and generous payout and not a little wellness payment. Winter said that the transparency of processes is very low in New Zealand, and he was saying that the process was widely advertised in Ireland, but in New Zealand, very few people know about the processes going on in health, the monetary redress in health, social development and education. And they don't advertise them because they feel flooded, but that does not justify not letting people know that these processes are available.
Mary,
So
I'm conscious of the time. We're at 4:30 and we need to finish by 5, and there will be some other questions for you. Could I ask you to quickly summarise funding for healing and your thoughts on the clean slate policy and other remedies, please? Thank you.
Yeah. So funding for healing needs to be part of a broader package. Should be available for as long as the individual needs it, and that The nature of the approaches needs to be broadly defined. This may include access to kaupapa Māori supports, reconnection to whānau, hapu and iwi, alcohol and drug counselling, sexual abuse counselling, peer support services, and so on. I would also like to talk about the clean slate policy that the survivors have spoken about the link between abuse and mental health services and entering the criminal justice system, the legacy of a life in institutions, mental health and penal is one of stigma and discrimination. A qualified clean slate policy would be a powerful mechanism to assist survivors' healing and opportunities for the future. And there are some examples of clean slate systems around the world. There are some other remedies which I think are interesting because they're a bit more lateral than the traditional remedies. I have cited some examples in my paper. A national memorial to publicly acknowledge people who were abused in state care. A national approach to remembering the people who died in psychiatric hospitals and were buried in unmarked graves. Compulsory education about state abuse as part of the national school curriculum in primary and secondary levels. Guaranteed access to university or tertiary education, placement in a program of choice, or payment of fees, costs and living expenses for this purpose. Free access to survivors for numeracy and literacy education, free access for survivors to primary health services. And these are all actual examples that occur somewhere in the world. To conclude, the road to the Royal Commission is lined all the way back to the 1840s with the casualties of abuse in mental health services. Governments, communities and mental health services have yet to fully reckon with this abuse. They must acknowledge the harm done, to provide redress and rehabilitation, and make systemic reforms that end institutionalisation, the dominance of psychiatry and compulsory interventions, as well as resolve the impact of colonisation. The Royal Commission is our overdue opportunity for New Zealand to draw a line in the sand and to say, e kore anō, never again.
Thank you, Mary. I just have a few supplementary questions that hopefully we can quickly go through. Just returning to the mental health and addiction inquiry, do you have any views about whether more work is required to mental health systems for Māori and to incorporate kaupapa Māori alternatives to psychiatry?
Look, Māori expressed disappointment in the inquiry, and one of the issues was the lack of recommendations specific to Māori, including the lack of a recommendation for the establishment of a Māori health authority. The report referred this on to the Health and Disability Review, and I don't see hopeful signs that the Health and Disability Review will result in a Māori health authority or the equivalent. After 170 years of the system failing Māori, they are calling for control over planning, funding and delivery of their own services and supports. And I support this, and I do hope that the Health and Disability Review supports this as well.
And turning to another topic, your evidence didn't give a ringing endorsement of mental health services and particularly psychiatric services. What alternatives would you see that clinical model in terms of psychiatric models, drug treatment, compulsory orders and the like?
People's lived experience outlined an alternative in the Wellbeing Manifesto for Aotearoa New Zealand, which was a major submission to the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry, which, with your permission, I could append to my evidence statement. The Wellbeing Manifesto calls for an end to a health-led system, and it talks about the need to move from big psychiatry to big community. And it describes what big psychiatry and big community are. In big psychiatry, we have deficits-based, we have a view about mental disorder, which is deficits-based. In big community, we talk about distress that we can recover from. In big psychiatry, entry to the system is controlled by health. But in big community, we need multiple entries into support. Most of the dollars, as I said before, in big psychiatry still go into what I call pills and pillow services. And we need far more resources to go into a broad menu of services and supports for people. You find in big psychiatry that most of the people who are paid to be there are medical and allied professionals. In big community, we are proposing that we have an equal mix of peer, cultural and professional workforce. Big psychiatry has a legacy of abuse and neglect, and big community has a commitment to human rights and partnership. There is a dynamic in big psychiatry around risk management. They're very focused on managing immediate risks, but in big community, the focus is on access, seeing people's strengths, and actually being accountable for long-term life outcomes. Big psychiatry's major tools are coercion, the Mental Health Act, and hospitals. The big tools for people who are struggling in crisis for big psychiatry is compassion, intensive support, and community-based crisis alternatives. And as I said, big psychiatry is an agent of colonisation that promotes one worldview, and big community needs to include multiple worldviews.
Thank you. And with the permission of the Commissioners, we will actually append that too, and it'll be Exhibit 10. Slightly different topic. You talked about Lake Alice and also Porirua, and there were experimental and punitive treatments. Were they more widespread than those two organisations or institutions at the time, and what about now?
Look, I think the type of abuses I described are less widespread today, simply because there are less people in long-stay institutions. But let's be clear, it still happens. And abuse doesn't just happen in the name of experimental or punitive treatment. It can be a part of standard treatment. And as I've said, to put someone on a community treatment order, to do so indefinitely, on drugs that can shorten their life, it, to me, is an abuse. And this happens thousands of times every year in New Zealand.
And from your perspective, what are the general attitudes that allow or sustain abuse to continue, and particularly with reference to the concepts of mentalism and ableism and discriminations of disabilities?
As I said earlier in my statement, stigma, prejudice and discrimination allow and sustain ableism and mentalism. And I think that's why programs such as the Like Minds, Like Mine program to uphold the mana and human rights of people with mental distress are so important and need continued and generous resourcing.
And you set out a fairly comprehensive recommendation of what you thought would be helpful on the way forward. But if you were saying to the Royal Commission that at the end of this process, from your perspective, are we looking at a tweak or a fundamental transformation?
I think a tweak will end in the same disaster. We need a fundamental transformation. And I gave you a hint of what that might look like in my answer to question 3 and in the Wellbeing Manifesto. But the first thing, in order to achieve a fundamental transformation, our laws need to comply with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which can only mean the end of the Mental Health Act and a move to supported decision-making. There is no other interpretation from 95% of the commentary that is coming out of the United Nations. The other thing is we keep building more hospital beds. Every time I hear an announcement of a new ward or a facility, I want to weep. Because despite people's best efforts, these wards are on the whole unsafe, unhealing and coercive environments. We need to drastically downsize hospital beds and create home-like and humane crisis services in the community. As I said, psychiatry is still the dominant force, and it needs to move from the hub of our system and become one of the spokes. We need people with lived experience in multiple sectors at the hub, developing policy, jointly funding and delivering a broad range of services and support. I'm not anti-psychiatry. I'm anti the dominance of psychiatry. Finally, we need to wholeheartedly, and I mean wholeheartedly, address the impacts of colonisation by giving back control to Māori to fund and provide services and supports to Māori. And in order to lay the ground for these changes, we have to fully reckon with the past, acknowledge the harm done, provide redress and rehabilitation in a very comprehensive, planned and wholehearted way.
Thank you, Mary. I have no further questions, but stay on the line and I'll check if the commissioners have any before we disband.
Thank you. I'll first of all ask Council if any has a wish to address cross-examination to Mary OHagan. There's none. Can I then ask my colleagues if there are any questions, and shall I start with Mr. Gibson?
All my questions have been answered, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Alofi-Bai.
Nothing further from me, thank you.
Thank you. Judge Shaw.
Mary, thank you very much for your evidence. I've just a short question on your paragraph 108 of your brief of evidence, in which you refer to the fact that the CHFA developed a settlement strategy and because it had received 336 psychiatric patient claims. Are you with me there?
Yes, yes. Yes, I am.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I have two questions about that. Do you have any idea what the period over which those claims were received was?
I don't. I think they went back. You mean the period of the abuse or the period the claims were made?
The period the claims were made.
I don't know, but I'm sure that information could be sought from Graham Bell, who's the former CEO of CHFA, or someone who is currently working in this area in health.
A motive for asking the question. I just wonder whether you think that the number of 336 claims is a true reflection of the numbers of people in psychiatric care who suffered abuse and neglect.
No, I think it's a drastic, I think it's a very small number. And as I said, you know, I remember finding out about this, and I was active in the movement, and I didn't even know this process existed until someone pointed it out to me. So they're very much under the radar, and I don't think that is a good way of running such a process.
No other questions.
Doctor.
Tēnā koe, Dr. OHagan. I just want to thank you for your thoughtful and comprehensive brief of evidence. I really enjoyed reading it and hearing from you. I want to thank you in particular for the emphasis and attention that you have directed towards kaupapa Māori subjects. Of course, it will be critical for this Royal Commission to hear directly from Māori themselves and Māori Pukinga on this kaupapa, both mental health and learning disabilities, but I want to acknowledge the mahi that you have done, and I found it very valuable. Kia ora.
Sure.
Mary OHagan, I have the final word, which is to thank you sincerely on behalf of the Royal Commission for your evidence and the way in which you've been able to give it, notwithstanding the technological difficulties that we have encountered this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and really appreciate your forbearance and patience and everyone else's in the room as we've gone through this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.